Leslie, start recording. All right. Hey, welcome, guys. This is the fifth of the series that we've started for the SRR Summer Internship Lecture Series. And as you guys know, I'm Scott Kirk. I'm a health physicist, and I also manage the Environmental Compliance Department for Savannah River Remediation on behalf of the Department of Energy. As always, I ask you guys to mute your microphones so it doesn't disrupt the presentations. And like I said, we welcome our summer interns for the last of the series, and I hope you guys have really liked it. Last week, we were able to listen to Dr. Cindy Jones from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, serving as a nuclear safety attaché, and she shared her experiences in supporting the international programs at the International Atomic Energy Agency, and also for the United Nations as well on behalf of the U.S. State Department. As most of you are aware that we have expanded the SRR summer internship because of COVID-19. We had a much lower population of interns this year, so we decided to broadcast this on WebEx. We've been recording each of these WebEx presentations, and last week we downloaded them onto YouTube. So you can do a search on YouTube. If you search on YouTube, the Health Physics Summer Internship Lecture Series, you should see each of the presentations. But we're also going to cut and paste the links for you guys as well and share it so that you'll have it handy. Before we start our final lecture by Dr. John Boice, who is the President and Director of Sciences for the National Council of Radiation Protection and Measurements, we have a special message of advice and encouragement for our summer interns and young professionals from Dr. Jonathan Sertain. Jonathan is the President of BWX Technologies Advanced Technology Program, and just this week, he was promoted to serve as the Chief Technology Officer. So, Jonathan, we're going to turn this over for you to give us a message for our interns. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really happy to be able to speak with you all today. It's actually my honor to introduce the topic of radiation dose and offer some brief words about how that is used within BWXT and for the products that we create. Also, on a especially personal level, as a pioneer in breast cancer research and low-dose radiation impacts human health, it's really my honor to get to speak to you today before Dr. Boice. My wife is a Vanderbilt-treated breast cancer survivor, so I'm really quite honored to get to go in front of Dr. Boice today. I was at NASA for about a decade, and after I left NASA, I had the opportunity to join BWXT to develop a specific cancer diagnostic drug, so-called radiopharmaceutical. It's not so much that this is new technology because the use of radioactive decay, gamma ray, photon emission has been used for diagnostic approaches in nuclear medicine for numbers of decades. But our approach was to use new technologies so that we could determine new sources for these isotopes or lower cost approaches for the manufacture of the isotope itself, or even uses of non-radioactive materials for the initial feedstock so that we can mitigate the use of uranium in the development of these types of products. So one of them in particular, molybdenum-99, is a fairly expensive pharmaceutical to produce, and we've been developing techniques to make this product in a much more economical way without the use of uranium, as I mentioned. In doing this, we've actually grown within BWXT a very diverse staff of young persons, now not just working on this diagnostic, but also in areas of therapeutic product development. So therapeutic drugs using radioisotopes are showing a lot of promise in the treatment of prostate, pancreatic, neuroendocrine tumor, and others. And so through the use of the actual radiated dose that comes out of the radioactive decay of these isotopes, we're learning how to impair the spread or even reduce the spread of certain types of cancers. Pretty exciting. So in our area of work, in a variety of different areas of engineering, nuclear, electrical, mechanical, computational engineering, and data science, we're developing diagnostic and therapeutic treatments for cancer. It's a pretty exciting application for nuclear medicine and specific to the use and application of the ideas around dose, as you'll hear Dr. Boice speak more of in a moment. We also use the idea of dose in another one of our exciting programs. NASA and the Department of Energy have contracted BWXT to design, manufacture, test, and hopefully one day launch an advanced propulsion system for Mars transport and deep space exploration, perhaps by humans one day. This propulsion system is intended to enable safe and rapid transport to Mars, and this is important because the nuclear propulsion system enables a much higher velocity than you would get from a chemical rocket, and this higher velocity thus comports into a reduction in total transit time. That reduction in transit time means that the astronauts are subject to less time in that high radiation environment. Consequently, lower dose for astronauts improves the health and security of the operating missions. So these pursuits in nuclear engineering involve more than just commercial nuclear power, more than nuclear weapons, or more than waste remediation. There's applications in medicine, space exploration, and naval propulsion, just to name a few. So I look forward to hearing Dr. Boice's presentation, and I thank you for listening to a few moments about what we use dose to do at BWXT. Scott?
Hey, Jonathan, thank you for that very positive message. I'm really grateful that you donated your time today, and I'm glad you had a chance to meet Dr. Boice as well. And
me too.
today our featured, excellent. So today our featured lecturer is from Dr. John Boice. He's the Director of Science and the President of the National Council of Radiation Protection and Measurement. Dr. Boice is also a professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University. As I mentioned, he's the director and president of the NCRP. He's an international authority on radiation health effects and served on the main commission of the International Commission on Radiological Protection and the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation and the Veterans Advisory Board on Dose Reconstruction. Dr. Boice was the first chief of radiation epidemiology branch at the National Cancer Institute. His seminal discoveries in over 350 publications have been used to formulate public health measures to prevent radiation-associated diseases. He served 27 years as a commissioned officer for the U.S. Public Health Service, retiring as captain. He visited Fukushima after the earthquake and tsunami and the reactor accident, and subsequently testified before the U.S. House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Dr. Boice received the Harvard School of Public Health Alumni Award for Merit, the E.O. Lawrence Award from the U.S. Department of Energy, the Gorgas Medal from the Association of Military Surgeons of the United States, the Outstanding Alumnus Award from the University of Texas, El Paso, and the Distinguished Service Medal from the U.S. Public Health Service. In 2019, the NCRP established the John D. Boice Jr. Young Investigator Award to recognize early career professionals engaged in the science of radiation protection and measurements. Dr. Boice has a BS degree in physics from the University of Texas, El Paso, a master's degree in nuclear engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute, a Master of Science in Medical Physics from Harvard, and a doctor's degree in epidemiology from Harvard. Dr. Boice directs the current million-person study of low-dose radiation health effects, examining the lifetime risk of cancer following the low-dose exposures received gradually over time. He studied the children of cancer survivals to assess possible genetic risk and a curvature of radiation treatments. He's engaged in research studies with the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Energy, as well as NASA. And with that, John, I'm going to turn it over to you to start your presentation. And thanks so much from the outset.
Well, you're very welcome. I wish my mother was on the line. I think she would have been very impressed with what you said. I appreciate that over-the-top introduction very much. And I'm going to start sharing the screen now to make sure we, There we go. So that I'm okay. I think we're ready to go. And I'm going to be talking about radiation epidemiology with a touch of NASA. And I very much appreciated Jonathan's introduction on the work that he's doing, because it'll fit in to this general issue with radiation health studies. One has to do with lowering the dose. Lowering the dose relates to lowering the risk. So our understanding from radiation epidemiology has told us that there are areas with regard to dose reduction that we can actually make without reducing the benefits from the exposures. The second thing is the importance of radionuclides in today's society. And one of the issues there, it's being used not just to, with therapeutic treatment and diagnoses as it has for years, but these are radionuclides that are also in the environment. And, it's good to have this balance of what the risks are, with regard to what the benefits that are accrued. So that fit in quite nicely with what I'll hope be able to finish or provide in the next few minutes. Also, I'm so happy to talk to interns and young people too, because I think that's the future of the United States. Is we need more people like you, radiation scientists, that are involved. So that's really a key thing, and the NCRP has a big focus on that. What I'm going to talk about, I'll give you a touch of radiation epidemiology, then touch on the 1 million person study. It's many more than 1 million persons, U.S. radiation workers and veterans. Then see how this all links to NASA and their mission, and then just a summary and a vision. And also, if you're interested, I'll have give me an email. we can always use some advice, collaborators on these myriad of projects that we're dealing with. Okay, radiation epidemiology. It's interesting. I used to have to explain what epidemiology was, but now with COVID, everyone now seems to know that epidemiology does not mean skin disease or issues like that. So, but the epidemiology is the study, of the causes of disease in human populations. It comes from epidemics. Epi means upon, and demos is the people. And so epidemiology is a study of what causes disease in people, and radiation epidemiology is the study of how radiation causes diseases and what diseases. And one of the things that is perhaps not appreciated, we know a lot about the health effects of radiation. It dates back over 100 years. There have been epidemiologic studies of these populations that have influenced how we behave and how we protect workers and how we protect the public. Röntgen discovered the X-rays in Württemberg in 1895, and shortly thereafter, Thomas Edison was developing the fluoroscope and also an X-ray light. Up there in the corner is his assistant, Clarence Darrow, and his hair fell out because the X-ray light was not that, it gave light, but it had health effects. He also, unfortunately, was one of the first martyrs. He got so much radiation in the development of the fluoroscope and the other issues with radiation that in the early 1900s, he died of bone cancer. The radium dial painters, and I'll talk about that, that was, back in the 1920s, the 1930s, it was a great job where young women would paint dials and ingest lots of, unfortunately, radium, and their bodies became radioactive. They developed bone cancer, but what happened, because of the people involved with that study, Robley Evans, they set standards with regard to the intakes of radionuclides, which were applied in the Manhattan Project. And that's why, in general, the exposures and the risks for American workers during the Manhattan Project were much, much lower than with the Soviet Union because of the knowledge that we gained. Radiologists told us something really interesting. Low-dose radiation over long periods of time can cause leukemia. You didn't have to get it all at once. The atomic bomb data then came began after in the 1950s with regard to studies, the foundation of radiation standards. Underground miners, a lot of studies showing that radon does cause lung cancer, and then they were followed by indoor studies. Indoor radon causes lung cancer. Chernobyl told us that the main point from Chernobyl was that environmental radioactive iodine can cause thyroid cancer in young children in particular. So we know a lot. And here's just, I'm just going to talk about a few studies, but if you just get a sense of all the studies over the last 100 years that give us quantitative estimates of what the risks are. So we know pretty much, not everything, about, relatively high doses. High doses might be, 50 rads, 100 rads, acute exposure. When you get lower down to 10 rads, things become uncertain with regard to what the risks are. And the other uncertainty is what happens when you get the dose gradually over time. So here's a number of the studies, and Jonathan mentioned radionuclides. So we've actually learned a lot about what are the risks if you have intakes of iodine with regard to the thyroid and other organs. What about radium? Patients were treated with bone disease with radium. And so one gets a risk, and now it's being used today in other treatments. And what are the risks associated with radium? So the past can inform the future to get this balance of risk and benefit. Now, one of the things that's really unique about radiation, we have standard committees that have existed since the 1920s. And this is the ICRP and the NCRP. We've been around since the 1920s, setting standards or making recommendations for standards that are then incorporated by the authoritative, bodies with regard to setting limits. These exist. The United Nations has reports, standing committees since 1954. The National Academy of Sciences and their so-called BEER reports. Even IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, provides radiation. There's a wealth of knowledge, but that exists and is currently being updated because of these standing committees. So it's it's different than smoking. We don't have standing committees on smoking. It's different than benzene. We don't have standing committees to look at, but on radiation we do. The other thing that's unique for radiation, we use the human data to set the standards. That's we don't rely upon chemical or models or mechanisms. They incorporated it somewhat, but the big driver is all this human data, but there's uncertainty. Now, here's the bottom one of the bottom lines with regard to radiation epidemiology. You can say, okay, Boice, what have we learned in 100 years? Okay. One of the big things is that we have changed the focus from genetic effects. Genetic effects means effects that are inherited by your children. You irradiate the parents. Will the children develop malformations or cancer or anything bad? What has happened, so the focus has changed from that to the risk on, what about me? You expose me, I'm at risk at cancer. What happened for genetic effects? The atomic bomb survivor data, when it was set up in the in the late 1940s, the focus was on studying the offspring of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These children of the parents who were survived have been studied for 70 years, and there is no evidence on any genetic abnormalities being inherited, whether it's malformations or cancer or stillbirth, neonatal deaths, genetic polymorphisms, anything. I mean, it's rather remarkable. Also, one of the things that I spent a good part of my career with, I studied the survivors of cancer. And I was so very, very glad to hear that Jonathan's wife is a survivor of cancer because of the curative treatments. When what the studies that we had done, we looked at all the cancer survivors in the United States during a period, Denmark and Finland, to see if there was any abnormalities in their children. And We also did not find any evidence for genetic effects. So this is, in radiation, you don't hear, not like this is, good news. Radiation, it's poisonous radiation, deadly radiation, as opposed to the curative radiation and the other stuff. But in terms of worrying about inheritance, that's really not an issue. So much so, and this is why I put this in, the NCRP, which is your national council, will be coming out with a statement in a month on gonadal shielding during abdominal and pelvic radiography. The NCRP, coupled with the American College of Radiology, American Association for Physicists in Medicine, all the knowledgeable groups are now recommending not to use gonadal shielding. It's really interesting. We're talking about risk-benefit, and you say, why? Isn't that important for children and young men and women to protect their testes and ovaries? Well, what happens when you do these shieldings, it messes up the image. So the benefit of doing the screening is reduced. And also, because of all these studies have come out, the human studies, there's very little evidence that there is a protective event. So the epidemiology does change policy, can be slow, but that's an important one, I think, for genetics. What does radiation epidemiology tell us now over these last 100 years? You get one exposure, you're at risk for cancer the rest of your life. That's rather remarkable. Now, that comes from the atomic bomb survivors. Even now, 70 years later, 74 years later, they're at increased risk. The young are more susceptible than the old, but there are some exceptions. It's not across the board. For example, lung cancer. Here's something that was interesting. In utero susceptibility, this is the developing fetus, is no greater than early childhood. So there is a risk, but it's not substantially greater than childhood. Females more susceptible than males. In large part, this deals with the sex organs. The female breast, the female ovaries are susceptible to radiation, whereas the male prostate and the male testes very low risk. And then risk, this is the other thing, risk differs by organ or tissues. And then some cancers have not been clearly related to radiation, like chronic lymphocytic leukemia, Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancers of the cervix, and a few others. So that's your radiation epidemiology in the thumbnail. Here's the other thing that came out from the Beer report and shows about radiation epidemiology and how difficult it is to conduct our studies. We're observational, and so we have to play the hand that we're dealt with. It's not a clinical trial. It's not an experimental design. And so what's the risk? If someone gets 10 rads, acute exposure, the prediction would be you'd have one excess cancer in 100 people. But that would be with a background of 42 of these 100 would develop cancer from the other causes, whatever that might be, genetics or smoking or pollution. Now, so that finds out how difficult it is. But then what if you get exposed? We're talking about, one rad, okay, 10 milligray. And then this now assumes linearity, that there is a straight line. So if you assume that, then you have one excess cancer, but amidst, the 420 naturally occurring, it's really statistically difficult to detect such a risk and also to control for other factors to distort risk. So why do we need it now? Why do we need radiation epidemiology? Why, is there still funding opportunities? Why is NASA interested? The big gap in our understanding is not that radiation causes cancer, yes, no, but how much radiation is caused when you get it gradually over time. When you get it in medicine, what about an accident, like at Fukushima, or a potential terrorist event with a dirty bomb? What about occupation? We still get exposures, in occupational circumstances, although nuclear power doses are very low. Some of the medical workers, though, using fluoroscopy, they're still up there. Environmental exposure, decontaminating and reclamation, and then high altitude space travel, not just going to Mars or going beyond Earth orbit, but also the frequent flyers, and the flight crew who fly higher and over the poles, and they have increased dose. In fact, the air crew collectively get more dose. This is collective dose. You multiply their estimated dose times the number of people than any other occupational group or flight crews. This is not astronauts. So there's really is a good need to assess that, what the risks are. And then it's in the public mind. This just came out from the NCRP, where in 2006, we had this remarkable publication that said, do y'all know how much radiation the United States public is getting from CT imaging examinations? It was a lot. It was almost, 3 millisieverts and effective dose. And it was, for the first time ever, it was the highest component of population exposure, more than ubiquitous background. What happened over these ensuing 20 years, or less than 20 years, people got concerned because the doses were so high that they changed the imaging procedures. They had voluntary organizations like Image Gently to get the same image with a reduction of dose. And now this just came out. This collective effort, even though CTs have increased a bit in some groups or flat, they've reduced. And so this was an importance, in general for the population. If you can keep the benefit, and this is now medical benefit, if you keep the benefit but reduce the dose, that is a good thing. And then there's other things, radiation epidemiology and radiation issues. And you guys working with radiation, you probably get a lot of asking questions. You're assumed to be the radiation expert, and you probably ask, hey, what about these PET scans? What about these antiparticles? What's a carbon ion that's going to treat me with? And protons, or is it safe to live near your nuclear? Is it safe to live near Savannah River? Or what about hydraulic fracturing? The fracking. I hear that brings up polonium and all this bad stuff. And what about cleanup, reactor accidents, potential? These are things that's in the public mind. And then the other thing, we have clinical trials right now. It's unclear whether they're warranted, but they're ongoing on treating COVID-19 pneumonia with, now it's called low doses of radiation. This is for a radiotherapist. For radiotherapy, a low dose radiation is 1 gray, 100 rads. So if there are now clinical trials ongoing in the United States and other countries to see if this might be a beneficial treatment of these patients with very serious COVID pneumonia, or in some of the trials not so serious. There is the concern that the radiation risk from, if you show some of those graphs, giving 100 rads is a lot different than 100, or 10 rads or 1 rad. In the mind. Here I'm going to talk about a few studies very quickly to give you a feeling. Then I'm going to ask you a question too. I know that'll be on the first one. And we mentioned that we've learned a lot about health effects since the turn of last century. And here's the British in the Sudan, and they have 1898. Now remember, 1895 the X-ray is discovered. So 3 years later, it's being used by the military. And so here's a patient. And here's the radiologist, here's the doctor, and here's the technologist. And here's the Crookes tube. Okay? Now, here's your question. You got the radiologist, you got the patient, and you got the technician. Who develops leukemia? Now we do Jeopardy. Dun, 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 dun. And the answer is the radiologist. Now, it's true the patient is he's getting a dose, but it's one-off. And then the technician, yeah, he's there, but look at the distance. So you have the radiologist right there, frequently, every day, getting low-dose exposures. Now, this is health physics, right? Time, distance, shielding. Here's the radiologist using his stopwatch. Here's the Crookes tube, no shielding. Distance. Distance is a key factor of the inverse square. As an aside, Madame Curie, although she developed, radium and polonium and she was, worked with radiation, in World War I, she helped out with the X-rays, and it's thought that her leukemic process may have been related more to her medical or military exposure than from all the radium and pitchblende exposures that she had. But time, distance, shielding, so And then this is backed up with studies of radiologists and technologists. If we look at the early British radiologists, and this is like a twofold risk, the U.S., China, they developed leukemia. It's not quantified, but it's clearly that they're in excess over expectation. In the United States, with regard to technology, large numbers of technologists, and in Japan and other countries, it's sort of a normal occurrence. So even today, the technologists are at much lower risk from leukemia. Part of the million-person study is to look at the risks of medical workers today and compare the risk between men and women, in large part because NASA is particularly interested in sex-specific differences. So we looked at lung cancer in particular, but also with regard to leukemia. So we have 100,000 men and women radiologists, nuclear medicine, oncologists, technologists, interventionalists, all of them. The dosimetry is very challenging. We have a team of dosimetrists. This is how, epidemiology without good dosimetry is pretty worthless in my view. So we've got teams with Craig Yoder, Larry Dower, Dick Vetter, Chris Passamore, Helen Grogan, that have put together our best estimates for these workers. One of the things we were surprised, I was surprised, was that wearing a lead apron made a horrendous difference, and everyone wore an apron, so our dose distribution was lower than what we had anticipated. But still, we had exposures up to, a trend looking up to 20 rads. This is very low dose, but we didn't find evidence consistent with the other studies for an increased risk of leukemia in our medical workers today. We also looked at lung cancer, and this is of interest to NASA, because one of the limitations, and I'll talk to briefly if I have time, is that because women are at higher risk of developing lung cancer based on the ABOM data, they have limited time and space. Okay? And therefore, it's important to look within multiple populations whether the women with chronic low-dose exposure would have equal, the same, or greater risk. And so in our study, now we find a slight risk with regard to the men, but no risk with regard to the women. Radium doll painters. I mentioned that in the 1920s, these young women would paint watch dials and gauges. This is a radium pot right there, and they did piecemeal. They got paid by the piece. They would lick the brushes, put the brushes in their mouth, and they ingested huge amounts of radium. And we're talking huge. They were walking waste dumps. And they also, and there's a wonderful book called The Radium Girls, which is very informative and also very sad. It shows how these young girls would go out on larks and with their bows, with their dates, the young men in the 1920s. And before going out, they would paint their teeth with these fluorescent paints. And they were orange and green, they glowed in the dark. And so they would smile and they'd light up the room, and it was they used the term a lark. It was fun for them, but unfortunately it led immediately to bone cancers, jaw deformations, terrible risk of bone tumor. This right here, this young lady in the back, she has mumps. So I'm encouraging everyone to make sure that they have their children vaccinated. Mumps is not a good thing, but back then there weren't any vaccinations. The other thing, so these are the radium doll painters. This is what it looks like. And what's really interesting, two things. One, it looked like you had to, even though so many of them developed bone cancers and sarcomas, many of them did, you needed a whole lot of ingestion. It's like, 10 gray, which is huge, amount of radiation. That's 1,000 rads, and we're not talking about a quality factor, to develop the bone cancers. And so it was informative in that it did break the bones, it did cause cancer, it was horrible, but you needed a lot. The other thing that was interesting, there was no development of leukemia. So this was now a part of the chemistry. Radium is like calcium, it goes to the bone. It gives off and it emits an alpha particle, helium nucleus. The energy is deposited in the bone matrix. It does not penetrate that much into the bone marrow where the stem cells are for leukemia. At least that's the theory. So that's one of the reasons for this study why there's bone cancer, but not leukemia. The other thing I just to mention, the million-person study, we are following this stuff now. The last follow-up of these 3,200 dial painters was in 1980, and 66% were alive. So we're working with the Department of Energy and the United States Transuranium Registry to follow up these women again to see if they're a lifetime risk of bone cancer, what it is. Do any of them develop leukemia? What about lung cancer? They had so much radium, they exhaled radon. What about breast cancer that might have developed? And how about dementia that might be related to radium dose to the brain? So this is now, we're following up. I mentioned we're working with the USTUR. We have the microfiche records going back to the 1915s. Okay, that's over 100 years ago, of all these individuals. And it's just remarkable. Also, they had donated their bodies for research. So the registry has tissue, the bones, radium has a half-life? 1,600 years. It goes to the bone. The bones are very, very hot. It's a radiation-restricted area. And then we look at the chemistry and brain tissue and do this really detailed evaluations that you don't think think happens for in epidemiology. We have a study team, and I just mentioned it. And one of the things, it's multiple disciplines. We can't work in a vacuum anymore. We've got to get the specialists who are the specialists in dosimetry, the specialists in radiation chemistry, the specialists in epidemiologic tracing, statistics, medical physics. And then also, I just mentioned that because perhaps you know them and they're part of your local chapters, Nicole Martinez and Derek Yokish have now, just last month, with associations with Oak Ridge National Lab, are going to be working with us and taking a major role in doing this next follow-up with regard to the radium dial painters, and they're going to be focusing first on the bone cancers, the old and the new ones that are developed. And we're just so very pleased that this is a possibility for young people being interested, and we're working out a mechanism for them to actually be involved. I mentioned, I'll just go quickly because of time. At MIAC, the Soviets, tried to catch up to the United States with regard to developing atomic weapons and then eventually the hydrogen bomb. But it began operations in 1948 at MIAC. I mentioned that they did not have safety precautions like was done in the United States. One of the terrible things that they did, they dumped radioactive waste into the river, the Tetra River, and all the people living downstream, it's called the Tetra River cohort, had intakes of radionuclides that have been related to cancer risk. But for the workers, they ingested so much plutonium that their lungs became necrotic. I mean, this is just huge doses of plutonium. And plutonium is similar to radium. It goes to the bone. So very similar to the radium dial study, and this deals with chemistry. The plutonium, in large part, when there's a risk, it's those that have the highest intake, and very little risk in those that have the lowest, body burdens or, amounts of plutonium. The other thing that was in this group of the plutonium workers only, no leukemia. So this was then a consistent double picture of that chemistry really matters when we're talking about radionuclides. And so radium and plutonium go to the bone. Mostly, if there is a concern of assessing risk, it's with regard to the bone, not leukemia. We've also done studies with Mallinckrodt, and which was a uranium processing plant in St. Louis, right at the first of the Manhattan Project. In fact, Compton, who was with the United States government, Compton from the Compton Effect, he came and met with Mallinckrodt and said, hey, we need 60 tons of uranium oxide, never produced before. Can you give it to us? And in about three months, Mallinckrodt, from pitchblende from the Belgian Congo, were able to produce the uranium oxide that was sent to Fermi in Chicago, and he had the first atomic pile, and the atomic age began. But it all came and started with Mallinckrodt. We're studying the workers. The doses and exposure are relatively low. Why? Those unfamiliar, the people in charge of the industrial hygiene and the monitoring, Merrill Eisenbud and Robley Evans. These are, kings within, health physics and radiation protection. So we had standards setting. And then just mention, when we do this exposure assessment, we had 7 different sources of exposure we took into account. We just didn't say, oh, they worked with radiation. We tried to quantify it. And they had film badges, chest x-rays for occupation. Then if they worked elsewhere, we got their dose. Urine analysis for uranium was incredibly important. And we had 40,000, people peed in a cup. And we had these evaluations to estimate breath radon. They took in so much radium that they breathed out radon, and that was then sent to the environmental measurement lab, in New York, and to evaluate. We used all of this, exposure dust and ambient radon. And so surprisingly, the numbers are small. It's 2,400, but there was no evidence for an increased risk of lung cancer following these exposures, up to about 40 rats. And so it was really informative. One interpretation, might be the effectiveness of uranium to cause lung cancer, or the low dose rate. But one of the values of the million-person study is we're going to combine all such studies like this together for statistical power: Los Alamos, Rocky Flats, and as we'll talk, maybe even Savannah River. So here's one of the other studies that we're conducting now. It's the Tennessee Eastman women. These are girls of the atomic city. Many of you may have read the book. It's a very popular book. And also, if you've looked at Countdown 1945, which Chris Wallace had just wrote about Harry Truman's making the decision to drop the bomb, there's a lot of discussion and interviews with the girls of the atomic city. So it's very informative. And we're interested because we have so few women who worked, we have numbers, but so few women who worked on the line in Department of Energy. And this is one of the unstudied groups where we've already traced them, and there's over 600 lung cancers. And we have right now a suggestion that there might be a lung cancer risk. I'm just going to mention the atomic bomb survivor data. It's the basis for our standards. It's been, just remarkable. But if you look here, when you get down to low doses, it's really hard, even though with all your modeling, to piece out what that risk might be. And so you can fit it with a straight line, a curved line, look at incidence and data. But beyond, and so it remains the standard. The million-person study and other worker studies is trying to give supplemental data on more healthy populations, and to see whether we can improve what the risk estimates might be at low doses for health effects as well as for science. So it's a really good study. I'll just mention that in the interest of time. It is the standards. One of the difficulties is generalization. It's an acute exposure in a 1945 population, but we're concerned about workers, public, interns at Savannah River who are young and healthy and developing low doses, if anything, over time. So it may not be representative. And though it's a large study, 86,000, some of the it's relatively small in some of recent studies. I'll go that. Here's another study that showed that low dose fractionated exposures causes breast cancer. In the 1930s, men and women who had tuberculosis were sent to sanatorium. If you're familiar with the Magic Mountain and the stories there, and there was bed rest, and you would be a young woman or young man, and you'd spend 5 or 10 years of your life in these sands. Then what came out was called pneumothorax, or lung collapse. You injected air into the pleural cavity, caused the lung to collapse, and you could go home. It was great. The men and women loved it. I've interviewed and I've talked to them. One problem, though, you had to come back every 2 weeks to get a chest fluoroscopy. Okay, how long? Your lung was collapsed for 3 years to 5 years. That's a lot of chest fluoroscopies. These young women developed breast cancer at a very high rate, and this is the Massachusetts fluoroscopy, study, and it was consistent. And I'll just mention it's consistent with the atomic bomb data. Women treated for acute postpartum mastitis with Nova Scotia fluoroscopy. So the fact that it was consistent with a straight line was interesting. But what was even more interesting was that fractionated low-dose exposures over years cause the same risk for breast cancer than was seen in. Oh, great. So we did a pooled analysis, and that splash was to do that. We put 8 cohorts together, and we learned more about what the risks are, not just 1 or 2 studies to make inferences. We also, studied children, and we were surprised that children who received radiation to shrink their thymus gland, a little gland over their heart when they're just 6 months of age, they were at high risk of developing, breast cancer later in life. And we were surprised because we thought the immature breast would not be that susceptible, and it was. Let's just go. One of the things, too, in all these studies and also replicated in other studies, we don't find a risk of lung cancer. And the lung cancer doses are, pretty high. On average, about, 84 rads and up to 100 rads, 200 rads. And there's no risk. And that's really interesting, and particularly with regard to NASA, because it appears that all tissues don't respond similar to fractionation. And also, you have to be cautious when generalizing. Million-person study. Okay, I'm going to touch on it. Who studied? Well, 1 million person. Not really. We actually have, we're starting off with about 5 million, and we hone it down, and the numbers are changing. These numbers have been increased because of nuclear submariners and nuclear shipyard workers and radium dial painters. But we're studying the Manhattan Project workers from DOE, our atomic veterans from the Department of Defense, nuclear power plant workers from NRC, industrial radiographers, also monitored by NRC, and then a whole lot of medical workers, which I had already mentioned. One of the things that's really unique in that we have, and it's thanks to our collaborators and supporters, we have small funding that comes from an appropriations bill that's been signed by the president for the last 2 years. So there's actually, this is remarkable because this is really small dollars, but we have a procurement that it's a line item that says the Department of Energy, Environmental Health, Safety, and Security must fund up to a certain level a study of 1 million U.S. workers and veterans. So we have enough funds to keep the lights on. Again, why is it important? It's for gradual exposures over time and get levels of risk that are different than the Japanese survivors. Also mentioned before, dosimetry is the key. We were over 5 years in getting a roadmap, a cookbook, on how to not just do the dosimetry, but then apply it to the epidemiologic study. We say 1 million persons, and I categorize them in 5 different areas. There's 29 individual cohorts that have been studied. Here's a nuclear power plant, and you can look at what the dose distribution. This is millisieverts if you want to divide by 10, and you get a feeling of REM. But we have nearly 150,000 with a broad dose distribution. We do convert badge dose into organ dose, and one of the things, too, is I'll show you that when you do the epidemiologic studies, you have to be concerned about other confounding. And the highest risk factor that we find in the nuclear power plant workers is not for cancer, but it's for mesothelioma because of the insulators. And so this back in the past, that was a big exposure that had a big impact. A relative risk of 5 is relatively large. But we also now are able to control for things. We look at leukemia, and we do find a small risk of leukemia, over 50 gray in this period, up to 50 gray, related to being employed in years past as a nuclear power plant worker. And so the value of our study is when we put all these other populations together to narrow the confidence bounds to see what the evidence of risk is at these lower doses. Many might be surprised that the United States had 230 above ground nuclear weapons test participants, or 230 above ground nuclear weapons detonations. And I understand that John Till had presented to your group a month or so ago, and he and I have been working on this for over 10 years. Our study was just published in full yesterday. So in the International Journal of Radiation Biology. So on the comprehensive nature of studying over 100,000 of our atomic veterans. And I'll just mention this in passing. That's one of the important components of the million-person study. And we also are going to be looking at heart disease. The doses in the atomic bomb survivors are relatively low. This is only up to 5 rads, so it's really hard, and confidence intervals are broad. But with regard to heart and cancer, there's just no evidence at this very low dose domain for any statistically significant increased risk of dose. NASA. Okay. Now, for NASA, the reason why they're interested in the million-person study is because it's prolonged exposure. Their standards right now, or their guidance, is based in large part on the acute exposure for the Japanese atomic bomb survivors. So NASA is providing funds for the million-person study for about 10 years just to get a better handle on prolonged exposures. I mentioned they're interested in sex-specific cancer risk as it might relate to lung cancer. And then what's interesting about cognition, if you get exposed to galactic cosmic rays, will you not be able to function? So let's see how much time we have and to do this. Here's the issue. Women are not allowed to spend as much time in space as men due to differences in lifetime estimates of cancer risk. NASA is relatively unique, and they estimate risk for individuals. In all the radiation monitoring systems that we have now, terrestrial radiation for workers, the estimates are effective dose, and it's generic. It's men, women, all ages, and you're regulated based on a certain level that's set by authorities and organizations. And it's 5 rem for NRC. People operate at 2 rem, and doses in general are much lower than that. But for NASA, because of this potential for higher risk and higher dose when you go beyond Earth orbit, they make estimates on individuals on your lifetime risk of developing cancer. And if it's greater than 3%, then you're limited your time in space. And it's actually the 95% confidence intervals around the point estimate. So the A-bomb data show that for all cancers, the radiation risk is twice as large, and lung cancer is the 800-pound gorilla. It's almost 3 times higher lung cancer risk for women. That restricts their time in space. And so you can imagine it's an issue too, and for women to then travel longer distances, which they probably would be allowed to, but they would have to then get different allowances. We have 150,000 women in our study. These are not secretaries. I just want to, these are Rosie the Riveters, women on the line, industrial radiographers, nuclear power plant, health physicists. They're all here, and so we're studying them to see if is there a risk. We've actually had one publication already looking at the million-person study in those tuberculosis patients. And so we're just starting, but we thought this would be good to get this out. One of the things, too, I've shown all the pictures of our collaborators. It's always hard for me to thank everybody at the end. If I thanked everybody, it would just take, there's just too many. I can't even list them, even the organizations. The people involved in the million-person study, there are hundreds of people from all walks of life, if you will, professions. But here was one of the things, and what we found in the million-person study, as opposed to the atomic bomb survivors and the MIAC workers, we don't find a difference between men and women. Now, more studies are ongoing, so this is not the definitive, but all the studies we've done don't find a difference, and also, we hardly find a risk at all. So that's actually going to be, it's a sort of a conundrum that, a scientific conundrum is, we will find risk like for leukemia, like you're not surprised, but then for lung cancer, we're not finding it, and then it's a conundrum. So we have another committee with all these top guys trying to work with us to try to put all these models together for NASA. Those familiar with radiation epidemiology, that's Dale Preston, Colorado State University, or Mike Weil, radiotherapist, Werner Room, from Munich, and also with the European space, Mikhail Skolnikov, the Soviet in Russia, and a nurse, Eric Grand, atomic bomb survivors. So we have a team that's trying to put all this stuff together, for us. And I'll mention too, one of the interesting things about the million-person study is we feel it's really, really important to evaluate radionuclide risks. These are the internal exposures, already mentioned, non-uniform dose distribution, chemistry matters, solubility matters, so many things. And the exposures were to polonium, plutonium, americium, radium, uranium, and even, Savannah River. And I'm just going to, mention Savannah River, briefly in a moment. At Mound, developed the polonium that started the reaction of polonium beryllium to produce neutrons that then you could detonate the plutonium bombs, like at Trinity, our first weapons test, and then the Nagasaki bomb, which were implosion devices with plutonium. And so we looked at these workers included polonium and external as well as tritium. And for lung cancer, again, we find no evidence of risk. As an aside, this is Litvinenko. He was poisoned, the Russian spy or dissident, with a pinprick, less than a microgram of polonium. He died a horrible death. He died in less than a month. Our biokinetic models that we use for our worker studies at Oak Ridge, Keith Eckerman and Rich Leggett, were used to make estimates of his polonium burden. And when they did the autopsy, it was rather remarkably close. Here's Los Alamos. There they had plutonium intakes. Also the Zia workers, those familiar with them are included. 800 lung cancers and very little evidence for lung cancer dose. Again, we're going to put all these things together. Now, I wanted to say something about Savannah River. Okay? Savannah River may very well be our next study. And this is just coincidence, but we did the follow-up. I asked yesterday, and we have just completed our epidemiology follow-up. We have 9,800, Savannah River workers, white men from 1952. We have now located 98.5%. Okay? As you can imagine, most have died, 80% have died, and 19% are alive. The epidemiology, in these situations when we dealing with internal doses, the epidemiology is usually way ahead of the dosimetry. And the dosimetry is really challenging. And then this is I just put this out, is that in the next, and we're going to discuss this next week in our workshop on the million person study with a DOE focus on dosimetry. We are going to see whether we have doses, ways to recreate the doses from the Savannah River cohort. And so we may be getting back to you, Scott or others. I don't think we've reached out yet, but just to see if you can give us some guidance on the files we have. And because I understand that some of these files here are really important if they're available and could be used, but then that's the next step. Because of the complexity of the dosimetry and the multiple processes that you guys have done at Savannah River, it is, the dosimetry is challenging. And so that's going to go, with our resources, deciding what we'll do. Do I have a moment? I'm just right on the ending. This is kind of an interesting thing. Galactic cosmic rays. Okay, we're going to Mars. It's not going to do any good to land on Mars if we're stupid. Okay, that's Ray Bradbury, and that's not related to the astronauts today, but the animal studies, the rodents, conducted at Brookhaven and elsewhere show that if you irradiate the mouse in various models with galactic cosmic ray simulation, galactic cosmic rays are like high energy iron, high energy silica, high energy, it's not, and then also high energy helium, that these mice develop cognitive dysfunction. They don't act very well, and they also have early Alzheimer's in some of the models. So they have dementia. So NASA is concerned about, if we send people to Mars, will they be able to complete the mission? Because the reaction times were not slowed. Or when they get back, will they remember where they were? And so they're basing everything, on the mouse model. And the mouse is really nice. They don't live that long, and the exposure rate is very high, and there is no human analog to galactic cosmic rays in the United States. But what we proposed to them, and the NCRP made this recommendation just a few months back, or the last part of 2019, when looking at central nervous system and dementia and all the complexities. The committee recommended that if you do studies of workers with polonium, radium, plutonium, uranium, and americium, they do expose the brain to high energy alpha particles, helium nuclei, and they could be studied for late effects, cognitive function and dementia. So NASA took that to heart, and then we've started studies of cognitive function and dementia. I mean, just to mention that. And this, the whole group of these guys making these decisions, Les Braby, Larry Townsend, many that some of you may know. So one of the things, when we did this, though, you think, and so you all should know that nothing passes the blood-brain barrier, right? So if you get a snoot full of plutonium, or you lick a brush of radium, it's not going to get to the brain, right? Wrong. What happened is, with all these autopsy material at the USTUR, this is plutonium workers. Plutonium is in the brain, and this is radiochemistry. And this is Einstein's brain, so I'm allowed to show it. But this is, and so these are the becquerels per kilogram. The brain weighs about 2 kilos. Right here on some of these workers, they're getting 2 and 3. Their activity is 2 or 3 becquerels. I mean, per kilo. So that's about 4 or 5 decays per second. 4 or 5 alpha particle decays per second, every second for 20 or 30 or 40 years. So the brain is getting exposure. So we then had justification. We have the group with Oak Ridge, Rich Leggett, and USTUR, Sergei Tolmachek, and others trying to put all this together for us and getting estimates of dose and what dose component. The other thing, that mentioned you're limited only by your imagination in the million-person study. We also are working with Northwestern and Argonne and the advanced photon source there. It's a synchrotron, and what they do, you get with X-ray fluorescence and get beam time, they can evaluate where the location of the radium or the plutonium might be in brain tissue from these workers that we're able to send them. So that's ongoing now, and this other unique component about deposition of dose in brain. We mentioned on the Mound facility, the radium doll painters. Here's then, this is nearly the last slide. So, okay, this is kind of good. A lot of stuff, Boice, you're doing. It's mortality. Not everybody with dementia, they die of something else. How do you get something better? CMS, that's the Medicare and Medicaid and nursing homes. There are records that are available that we have approval to access. They have cognitive function tests. And we can link our rosters of many hundreds of thousands of workers who have intakes of radionuclides with these files and see who has a diagnosis of dementia, cognitive impairment. And then we can relate it to dose to the brain. That's rather, remarkable that we can do this. As a test case, I took one of these tests. I'm old enough. It's 2 to 3 hours. It is really, if anyone's taken a cognitive function test, it was, I was scored, and it was really challenging. I mean, they ask you questions like, really quick, fire. Who wrote Alice in Wonderland? Okay, that's good. I went blank. I had no idea, blank on that. Oh gosh. But then they asked, what's the circumference of the Earth? No problem. How long does it take light to travel from the sun to the Earth? No problem. And then they said I'm okay for someone of my age, which was a little bit disheartening. But then my score is there. And so if in fact we do this, then for what our next phase would be, we would interview workers who have plutonium exposures in years past, like at Los Alamos, perhaps at Rocky Flats, and we'd interview them and use the same cognitive battery of tests that the astronauts are using today at the International Space Center. Radiation epidemiology, there we go. 100 years of research. There's still more to be learned. Also, if you notice the multidisciplinary approach, we need for our nation more health physicists. We need more radiation chemists. We need radiation professionals. It's a big deal. Million-person study, this is all the past. And we're doing these studies not just to learn more about radiation effects, but to deal with real-time issues dealing with CT scanning, with regard to NASA missions, DOE, NRC, innovative possibilities. We're limited only by our imagination. And so I throw this out. Anyone interested, partnering, collaborating, advising us? Give me get back. And I know for Savannah River, we'll get back to you about dosimetry, someday, whether in a month or 2 months or a year. But, just to say, just like with Nicole Martinez and Derek Yokish, we had just through the relationship with Oak Ridge National Lab and the Center for Knowledge Transfer and Excellence, they were interested. That works. What are we going to do? We're going to complete all these studies. We're going to consider studies of neutrons. We're going to try to combine all these data. This is really complex. We're going to consider, this is something just thrown out, AI, machine learning. We have 1 million people with thousands of data points. And then we'd consider this innovation of creating a National Center for Radiation Epidemiology and Biology. And so, I love this show, The Greatest Showman. 1 million dreams are keeping me awake. And so this is what I do. This is why I'm not retiring. I'm way past the age. I take cognitive function tests. But still, this is also interesting. And some of the people we work with, we do have a passion. We're going to have all of this coming out in a special issue of International Journal of Radiation Biology, all the many things that we're talking about. Here's one, the Greater New York chapter of the Health Physics Society, a symposium they're sponsoring November the 6th. And we're going to be talking about the importance of radiation epidemiology from the agency perspective, and then we're going to have specific topics discussing after that. It'll be all day, like 9 to 4, and you'd be more than welcome to attend. In fact, if your local chapter want to sponsor, just say, yeah, we think this is a good idea. You could do that, just like the Baltimore, Washington chapter. Then, of course, a word for our sponsors. It's been 25 years, and we've had support. The size of the logo is directly related to the amount of funds they've provided for us. And so that's been a good thing. Currently, we're funded by the Department of Energy, NASA, and the United States Navy, although we do get a lot of support from other agencies, mainly in kind. And what's this I like? The organizations don't support what we do, they support why we do it. In large part, we're the National Council for the nation, and we try to be responsive to their needs. So now we're ending. If you thought this was of use to use, please tell Scott that it was so typically brilliant of him to invite a radiation epidemiology for these intern sessions. So please, but if in fact you feel this way, please don't bother. And so, when you do Zoom, we can't even, see how everyone's doing, but I hope it wasn't like this. Thanks very much. I really appreciated this opportunity. I hope I didn't go on too long. And now I guess here, with my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra, I'm willing to stay around for some questions if there's time. But if you ask me anything I don't know, I'm just not going to answer it. So thanks very much. And I'm going to now return control, I guess, or can you take control, Leslie? Or do I have to?
Yeah, you just have to stop sharing content.
Okay.
But at this point, we could start with questions. We've previously done raising the hand function with WebEx. So if everybody could try to use that for any questions for John, I'll scroll through and see if there are any hands raised. All right, I don't see any hands raised just yet. If you have a question, just go ahead and ask John. No questions, I guess, John. You're just such a good presenter.
No, that's fine. Could I, if there is none, I'll do one last slide just for, and can I share, can I get back and share the screen, share my content?
Yes, I will.
If you just let me do that. You're now the presenter, and I'll just
Yes.
this is in the last side set. If in fact people want a tiny bit more about this whole issue of radiation epidemiology and health effects, I partnered with the CDC last year, and it's now out on 7 or 8 educational modules on radiation epidemiology and for public health decision making. But it describes some of the studies, and so it's somewhat an informative, easy to watch series with 7 different topics. And if you're into, it also gets you continuing education credits too. So I just mentioned that as something for those that would like a little. Well, okay, this is great. How is it interesting? Can it affect me? The other thing too, if you really wanted a lot of detail, much more specifics, the National Cancer Institute, the Radiation Epidemiology branch, has completed a course last year, and it's now available. And it's about 20 lectures and slide presentations, and it's very comprehensive, and they did it for their fellowship training. And so I also have that link there. So I just wanted to mention that for those that may be curious about other. Okay.
Thanks, John. And that continuing education credit really does help too.
Oh, good. Well, it's
Okay, well, this is Scott. Can everybody hear? Can you hear me, John?
Yes, I can.
Hey, I wanted to thank you. That was a brilliant presentation. That was most enjoyable. Thank you very much for the time that you spent to put this together and that you shared with us today. It was a real benefit to all of our interns and our young professionals. And I'd also like to thank all the other presenters, Dr. John Teal, Margaret Severus, Larry Camper, Dr. Cindy Jones, and yourself. It was just outstanding. We've recorded these. We'll be sharing them, and I think it will carry on for a long time to come. So thanks a million for your help.
You're very welcome, and I'm very glad you called upon me. And if in the future you find such presentations or reviews of usefulness, I like to reiterate, I'm your national counsel. So I do this also as part of my, I want to do this and also encouraging young people to get involved in radiation. So in the future, if there's specific topics, whenever, please call upon me.
Yeah, most certainly. Hey, with that, we'll sign off. And again, thank you all. We very much enjoyed hosting this lecture series. We hope you enjoyed it just as much. Take care.